You ever open a letter so ridiculous you actually laugh before realizing your entire life is sitting inside that envelope? The metal mailbox door slammed shut with a hollow bang that echoed across the quiet Texas morning as I stood there barefoot in the gravel driveway, holding a certified letter from Willow Creek Estates HOA. The air smelled like wet cedar and fresh dirt from the storm that rolled through overnight. Water still dripped from the old oak trees lining the ranch road my grandfather carved out with a bulldozer back in 1968. I remember staring at that envelope while the first light of sunrise crept across 1,500 acres of Whitmore land. Land my family had owned longer than most people in that county had been alive. The paper felt stiff and expensive between my fingers, the kind lawyers use when they want intimidation to feel official. I flipped it open right there beside the mailbox. Community Road Usage Assessment. Amount due, for $1,820. Failure to comply may result in property seizure proceedings. Property seizure. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain refuses to process stupidity at that level on the first try. The smell of rain-soaked gravel filled the air while I read the letter again slower this time. According to Willow Creek Estates, I owed them maintenance fees for driving across the private access road that cut through my own inherited ranch land. My grandfather's land. My father's land. Mine. They were threatening legal action if I failed to pay within 30 days. Somewhere down the hill, I could hear lawn sprinklers hissing awake inside the HOA subdivision like mechanical snakes. That sound always irritated me. Perfect little rows of expensive homes sitting where cattle used to graze when I was a kid. Back then, this valley smelled like hay, diesel fuel, and mesquite smoke drifting from branding pits in the summer heat. Now it smelled like fresh asphalt, chlorine, and money pretending to be class. My name is Caleb Whitmore. I am 38 years old, and until 3 months ago, I spent most of my life working pipeline infrastructure contracts up in Alaska. 12-hour shifts. Frozen. Steel. Wind sharp enough to cut through gloves. When my grandfather Walter Whitmore passed away, he left me the entire ranch because I was the only one in the family who still cared enough to come home. I figured I would clean up the estate, maybe lease a few sections to cattle operators, fix the old cabin near the lake, and finally breathe for the first time in years. I thought the hardest part would be grief. I was wrong. I folded the HOA letter and walked back toward the cabin while cicadas screamed from the trees. The porch boards groaned beneath my boots exactly the same way they did when I was 10 years old chasing my grandfather around with a fishing pole bigger than I was. Inside the cabin, everything still smelled faintly like black coffee, motor oil, and old leather. His boots were still beside the door. His reading glasses still sat crooked beside a stack of county maps on the kitchen table. Losing him felt like someone cut the foundation out from under this place. I poured myself stale coffee from yesterday's pot and sat down at the table again, staring through the dusty kitchen window toward the subdivision sitting almost half a mile south of the cabin. Willow Creek Estates. About 80 luxury homes. Tennis courts. Clubhouse. Decorative fountains. The entire development wrapped around the lower section of Whitmore Valley like it belonged there. My grandfather hated that place. He used to call it the Plastic Kingdom. Said every house looked like it had been assembled from the same cardboard box. I remember asking him once why he sold the land leased to developers in the first place. He looked at me over his coffee mug and said something that made a lot more sense years later. I leased it, he said. I never sold a damn inch. At the time, I thought nothing about it. Lease. Sale. Legal language old ranchers worried about. But after reading that HOA threat sitting in my kitchen, those words started rattling around in my head louder and louder. I stood up and walked toward the hallway closet where my grandfather kept decades of land records stacked inside dented metal lockboxes. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight cutting across the room. While I dragged one of the heavy boxes onto the kitchen floor, the steel latch squealed open. Inside sat old survey maps, yellowed deeds, mineral rights agreements, and tax records tied together with fading red string. Paperwork older than me, older than the subdivision. Older than most of the people now trying to tell me where I could drive on my own property. Then I found it. A thick binder stamped Whitmore Valley Commercial Ground Lease Agreement. My pulse slowed instantly. Somewhere outside, a golf cart buzzed down the distant HOA road while sprinklers hissed across expensive green lawns sitting directly on top of my family's land. I opened the binder carefully, and halfway down the first page, I saw the line that changed everything. Initial term, 99 years. Remaining term balance, 14 days. I sat there for a long time with that lease binder open across my grandfather's kitchen table while the ceiling fan clicked overhead with that slow, uneven rhythm I remembered from childhood summers. The pages smelled like dust, old ink, and machine oil. My grandfather used to keep everything inside heavy binders because he never trusted computers. Said paper could not be hacked and county clerks could not accidentally delete history. Turns out the old man knew exactly what he was doing. Outside the kitchen window, the morning fog was finally burning off the lower valley, revealing rows of oversized houses spreading across Whitmore land like somebody spilled concrete over a cattle pasture. Willow Creek estates looked peaceful from a distance. Expensive roofs glowing under Texas sunlight. Decorative ponds. Perfect sidewalks. Little golf carts moving around like worker ants. But now all I could see was a 99-year ground lease ticking toward expiration in 14 days. 14. My coffee had gone completely cold by then, but I drank it anyway while flipping through page after page of legal language. Most people hear 1,500 acres and picture endless empty land. That is not what Whitmore Valley was anymore. My grandfather leased the southern section to developers back in the 1970s when this county was still mostly ranchers, oil workers, and feed stores. The agreement allowed residential development while preserving Whitmore ownership underneath it all. The developers built neighborhoods, shopping strips, utility corridors, roads. Then over the decades, ownership changed hands so many times nobody bothered checking the original ground lease anymore. Or maybe they assumed the Whitmore family was too scattered or too dead to notice. My grandfather noticed. He noticed everything. I could still hear his boots crunching gravel outside before sunrise every morning when I was a kid. He would wake me before dawn during summers and drag me across the ranch checking fence lines while the air smelled like wet dirt and diesel fuel. He taught me how to read survey markers before I learned algebra. Said land ownership was not about paper. It was about memory. If you do not walk your land, he used to say, someone else eventually will. Back then I did not understand what he meant. I thought I would leave Texas forever. And honestly, I almost did. By 22, I was welding pipeline sections in North Dakota winters where the wind cut through 3 layers of clothing like ice water. Then came Alaska. Remote camps. Frozen steel. Weeks where the only smell in the air was snow, hydraulic fluid, and burnt coffee from industrial generators humming all night long. That kind of work changes your brain. You stop thinking in days and start thinking in weather conditions and equipment failures. I spent 16 years building infrastructure for other people while my grandfather stayed here, quietly protecting land nobody else in the family even visited anymore. My sister Emily moved to Scottsdale and sold real estate. My cousins wanted condos in Dallas and stock portfolios. Nobody wanted ranch land. Too much responsibility. Too isolated. Too slow. But every Christmas my grandfather mailed me photos anyway. The old fishing dock beside the lake. The cattle pond after heavy rain. Sunrise over the eastern ridge. Looking back now, I think he knew exactly who he was preparing to inherit this place. The cabin creaked softly around me while I walked toward the hallway and stared at old family photos hanging crooked on the wall. 3 generations of Whitmore men covered in dirt, sweat, and sunlight. My father standing beside an old Ford truck with grease on his hands. My grandfather holding a catfish bigger than my torso when I was 8 years old. Nobody in those photos wore expensive clothes or country club smiles. They looked tired, honest, real. And suddenly that HOA letter sitting on the table felt personal in a way I could not fully explain yet. It was not about $4,000. It was not even about the threat. It was the arrogance of it. Somebody living on Whitmore land thought they had the authority to threaten a Whitmore off his own property. That realization settled into my chest slowly like a storm rolling across open pasture. Around noon, I drove down into Willow Creek Estates for the first time since returning to Texas. My truck tires hummed against perfectly paved roads lined with decorative stone walls and identical mailboxes. The place smelled like fresh mulch and chlorine from the community pool. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across bright green lawns, while workers trimmed hedges with military precision. Everything looked manufactured, controlled, like a movie set pretending to be a neighborhood. I rolled past the clubhouse near the center of the subdivision and nearly laughed. The building sat directly beside Whitmore Lake with giant wooden signs advertising wedding rentals and private events. Luxury lakeside venue experience. Starting at $6,000 per weekend. There were at least 40 vehicles parked outside. Contractors unloading catering supplies. Workers setting up white folding chairs near the water. My shoreline. My family's land. And apparently somebody was making a fortune off it. The deeper I drove into that subdivision, the stranger it felt. Every street curved intentionally to hide the fact that the entire neighborhood sat inside a valley surrounded by Whitmore acreage. Like the developers wanted residents to forget where they actually lived. Then I saw the sign near the entrance fountain. Willow Creek Estates. A private community. Established 1981. Beneath that sat a smaller plaque listing the HOA board members. I stopped immediately on one name. Vanessa Holloway. HOA president. Something about that name felt familiar. Then I remembered. 2 nights earlier at the county diner, an old rancher named Curtis mentioned her while we drank coffee at the counter. Careful with that Holloway woman, he told me quietly. She thinks she owns half the county because her husband signs zoning permits. At the time I ignored it. Standing there now beneath that polished stone sign with the Texas heat rising off the pavement and the smell of chlorine drifting through the air, I realized something important. The people running Willow Creek Estates had forgotten one critical detail. They built their entire kingdom on leased ground. And in 14 days, that ground came back to me. I met Vanessa Holloway 3 days later, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of expensive perfume mixing with chlorine and fresh-cut grass as her white golf cart rolled across the clubhouse parking lot like she owned the entire valley. She stepped out wearing a cream-colored blazer despite the Texas heat. Oversized sunglasses balanced perfectly on blonde hair that probably took more maintenance than my truck engine. Everything about her looked polished in that aggressive suburban way. Perfect nails, perfect smile, perfect posture. The kind of woman who treated HOA bylaws like constitutional law and expected everyone else to do the same. I had just parked near the clubhouse to take photos of the lake access road when her shadow crossed over the hood of my truck. "You must be Caleb Whitmore," she said before I even introduced myself. Her voice sounded smooth and practiced, like someone who spent years learning how to insult people politely. I heard Walter's grandson finally decided to come home. The way she said finally carried more judgment than sympathy. The afternoon sun reflected off the clubhouse windows behind her, while wedding workers carried stacks of white chairs across the lawn overlooking Whitmore Lake. Somewhere nearby, an industrial ice machine hummed steadily. The air smelled like sunscreen, lake water, and fresh concrete heating under August sunlight. I nodded once and introduced myself anyway. She smiled wider, but it never reached her eyes. "Vanessa Holloway," she said, extending her hand slowly. "President of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." I shook her hand. Cold grip. Controlled pressure. She immediately looked past me toward the truck like she was conducting an inspection instead of a conversation. My grandfather always warned me about people who smiled before asking for something. Vanessa smiled constantly. "I assume you received our assessment notice," she said casually. "The roads here require significant maintenance. Residents contribute equally for community upkeep." Residents. I almost laughed at that word. "I am not one of your residents," I told her calmly. "And that road sits on Whitmore property." Her smile froze for maybe half a second before snapping right back into place. "Well, technically," she said carefully, "these properties have been integrated into county development planning for decades." Integrated. Another interesting word choice. She spoke like a woman used to winning arguments through confidence alone. Before I could answer, a maintenance worker drove by in a utility cart and nodded nervously at her without slowing down. Vanessa barely acknowledged him. That told me almost everything I needed to know right there. Fear travels downhill fast in places like that. She turned and gestured proudly toward the subdivision spread across the valley. "We have built a beautiful community here," she said. "Families invested their futures into Willow Creek Estates. Property values have tripled under this board." There it was. Ownership language. Not stewardship. Not partnership. Control. I looked past her toward the lake where 2 teenagers were unloading paddleboards beside a dock my grandfather personally built in 1974. The original cedar beams were still under there somewhere beneath all the expensive renovations and HOA signage. Seeing that Whitmore dock covered in branded community banners made something tighten in my chest. Vanessa followed my eyes and smiled again. The residents absolutely love the waterfront amenities, she said, especially wedding season. Last month alone we hosted 11 events. 11 events. $6,000 minimum each according to the signs outside. I started doing rough math automatically in my head. My years working infrastructure contracts taught me one important skill. Follow the money. You run weddings here? I asked. Among many other things, she replied proudly. Farmers markets, seasonal festivals, outdoor concerts. This community generates considerable revenue. There was that word again. Revenue, not neighborhood activities. Business operations, all sitting directly on leased land expiring in less than 2 weeks. I kept my face neutral, but inside my brain was already moving faster. Vanessa leaned slightly closer, then lowered her voice like we were sharing private wisdom. Walter was always difficult about progress, she said. Very stubborn man. Refused to modernize with the rest of the county. My jaw tightened immediately. Nobody talked about my grandfather that way, especially not standing 20 feet from the lake he protected for 40 years. But Vanessa either did not notice or did not care. Thankfully, she continued, the county understands how important this community is now. We have excellent relationships with zoning, utilities, development offices. My husband works closely with many of them. There it was. The real introduction. Not HOA president. Political connections. The afternoon wind carried the smell of barbecue smoke from somewhere deeper inside the subdivision, while sprinklers clicked rhythmically beside the entrance road. People jogged past us wearing expensive workout clothes, completely unaware that the woman running their neighborhood was quietly warning me not to interfere. Vanessa reached into a leather folder and handed me another envelope. Speaking of community standards, she said pleasantly, your cabin received several appearance complaints from nearby residents. Exterior maintenance violations. We will need those resolved promptly. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Exterior maintenance violations. For a cabin older than her entire subdivision, sitting on land her HOA did not even own. You are finding me? I asked slowly. She tilted her head slightly behind those sunglasses. We are maintaining standards, she corrected. Everyone contributes when they live in Whitmore Valley. That sentence landed harder than she intended because she still did not understand something critical. People like Vanessa always mistake proximity for ownership. They build systems, committees, rules, little kingdoms stacked on paperwork and confidence. Then after enough years pass, they start believing they own the ground beneath them too. As she climbed back into her golf cart, she paused long enough to give me one final smile. I hope we can avoid unnecessary legal complications, she said sweetly. Then the cart hummed away across the parking lot, leaving behind perfume, dust, and the unmistakable feeling that this woman had been getting away with things for a very long time. I looked down at the violation notice in my hand while the hot Texas wind rattled the paper softly. That was the moment I realized this was not just an HOA problem anymore. This was a business empire built on leased land by people who had completely forgotten who actually owned the valley beneath their feet. The violations started showing up every morning after that meeting with Vanessa like clockwork. Thick white envelopes taped to my cabin door before sunrise. Unauthorized exterior materials. Improper agricultural storage visibility. Unapproved vehicle parking. I stood there one humid morning holding 3 separate notices while the smell of wet cedar drifted off the porch and mockingbirds screamed from the fence line. One violation claimed my grandfather's rusted cattle trailer constituted visual blight. Another cited my truck for commercial appearance even though it carried standard Texas registration. The third one actually complained about excessive natural vegetation around Whitmore Lake. Excessive natural vegetation. They were trying to find me because grass and wildflowers existed beside a lake that had looked exactly the same since Richard Nixon was president. I pinned every notice onto the kitchen wall beside the old county maps while the ceiling fan rattled overhead. The papers were starting to stack up like somebody was building a case file instead of running a neighborhood. That same afternoon, I drove into town for fence supplies and stopped at Mason Feed and Hardware near the county line. The place still smelled exactly the way it did when I was a kid. Fertilizer, dust, coffee brewing somewhere behind the counter, old wood floors creaking beneath work boots. Curtis Nolan sat on his usual stool near the register drinking black coffee from a foam cup, while country music crackled softly through a radio older than me. He looked up the second I walked inside. "Heard Holloway's people are already sniffing around your cabin," he muttered before I even reached the counter. News traveled fast in counties like that. I grabbed fencing gloves and nodded once. "They sent me 6 violations in 4 days. Curtis laughed quietly into his coffee. "6? Hell, son, that means Vanessa likes you." The old men sitting nearby chuckled under their breath. One guy in a feed company hat leaned closer and lowered his voice. "You know they charge vendors nearly $2,000 every weekend just to set up at that little farmer market down there," he said. "Whole subdivision operates like a business now." Another rancher shook his head slowly. "Wedding venue too. My niece catered one there last month. Fancy lake ceremonies. $7,000 minimum package." $7,000. My stomach tightened instantly. The smell of motor oil and old leather filled the store while I started connecting numbers in my head again. Weddings, market permits, clubhouse rentals, parking fees, HOA dues, utility agreements. They were not just running a subdivision anymore. They had built a commercial machine directly on Whitmore land. Curtis took another sip of coffee and looked at me carefully. "Walter knew this day was coming," he said quietly. "That old man never trusted development people, especially not the Holloways." I asked him what he meant. Curtis scratched his gray beard slowly before answering. "About 10 years ago, Vanessa tried buying permanent easements around the lake. Walter refused every offer. Said she kept acting like the valley already belonged to her." That sentence sat heavy in my chest all the way back to the ranch. By the time I reached the subdivision entrance, the afternoon heat had turned brutal. Waves of heat shimmered above the pavement while landscapers trimmed decorative hedges beside giant stone signs welcoming residents home. I noticed something different that day, though. Security carts. 2 of them slowly cruising the roads like patrol vehicles. One of the guards actually stepped into the road and raised his hand for me to stop. My tires crunched against fresh gravel as I rolled down the window. The guard wore a gray polo shirt with Willow Creek Community Security stitched over the pocket. Probably mid-20s. Nervous eyes. Cheap sunglasses. "Residents only beyond this point today, sir," he said carefully. I stared at him for a second because I genuinely thought he was joking. "This road crosses Whitmore property," I replied. "I own the land underneath your tires." The poor kid looked uncomfortable immediately. He shifted his weight awkwardly and glanced toward the clubhouse like he was hoping somebody else would handle this conversation. "I am just following HOA instructions, sir." There it was again. Instruction. Everybody in that subdivision operated like Vanessa was running a private government instead of an HOA. Before I could answer, another golf cart approached from the clubhouse parking area. Vanessa stepped out dressed in white tennis clothes this time, visor perfectly angled against the sun. She walked toward my truck smiling like we were old friends meeting for lunch. "Caleb," she said brightly, "there seems to be confusion regarding community access policies." The smell of sunscreen and fresh chlorine drifted behind her from the pool area. I could hear children laughing somewhere near the clubhouse while workers unloaded flower arrangements beside the lake for another wedding event. "Your security guard just blocked access to my own property," I said flatly. Vanessa folded her arms calmly. "We are protecting residents from unauthorized traffic flow during private functions." "Private functions? On leased Whitmore land." I pointed toward the wedding setup near the shoreline. "You charge money for those events?" Her smile tightened slightly. "Our financial structure is not your concern." Wrong answer. Vanessa recovered fast. Too fast. The flicker in her eyes lasted maybe 1 second before that polished smile slid right back into place like nothing happened. But I saw it. Recognition. Fear wrapped in confidence. She adjusted the strap on her designer handbag and looked toward the clubhouse where wedding guests were beginning to arrive in pressed suits and pastel dresses. Expensive SUVs rolled slowly through the entrance while valets jogged across the parking lot under the brutal Texas sun. Somewhere near the lake, a violinist was testing microphones for the ceremony. Soft music drifted across Whitmore property while the woman running the entire operation pretended she had not just been cornered by her own lease agreement. "You really should speak with county development before making assumptions," Vanessa said calmly. "The legal structure here is far more complicated than old paperwork in a ranch cabin." Old paperwork. That phrase irritated me more than I expected. People like Vanessa always dismissed history whenever history threatened their position. I watched her climb back into the golf cart while hot wind pushed dust across the road between us. "Enjoy your afternoon, Caleb," she said sweetly before driving away toward the clubhouse patio where employees immediately straightened posture the second she approached. I sat there gripping the steering wheel while the air conditioner hummed weakly against the 100-degree heat. My instincts from years working contract negotiations up north started screaming at me right then. Vanessa already knew the lease existed, which meant one of two things. Either she believed she had legal protection somewhere inside county government, or she thought I would panic and fold before the expiration date arrived. Neither option made me feel better. Back at the ranch, I spent the next 48 hours buried inside county records, lease binders, and property maps spread across my grandfather's kitchen table. The cabin smelled like dust, coffee, and old paper, while ceiling fans pushed heavy summer air in slow circles overhead. I barely slept. Every hour revealed another layer underneath Willow Creek. Estates, utility easements, commercial permits, vendor contracts, temporary event licensing. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. The HOA was not just collecting homeowner dues. They were operating a full-scale revenue business on leased Whitmore land. Wedding venue packages, seasonal festivals, outdoor concert permits, recreational dock memberships, farmer market vendor fees. One financial statement I found online estimated annual event revenue at nearly $2 million. $2 million. My grandfather leased grazing land to developers back when this county barely had paved roads. Now somebody was monetizing every square inch of his valley like a resort destination. On the third morning, I drove to the county records office downtown, carrying copies of the original lease agreement inside a leather binder. The building smelled like industrial cleaner and stale air conditioning. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while clerks shuffled paperwork behind thick glass partitions. I waited nearly an hour before finally sitting across from a zoning attorney named Richard Bellamy. Mid-50s. Expensive watch. Silver hair combed too carefully. The kind of man who smiled before saying no. He flipped through the lease documents slowly while tapping a gold pin against the desk. "Interesting records," he admitted. "But these developments have operated continuously for decades. Courts tend to favor stability in long-term residential communities." Stability. Another carefully selected word. "The lease expires in 11 days, I said. "And according to Section 8, all commercial operations require renegotiation upon expiration." Bellamy leaned back in his chair and folded his hands calmly. "Mr. Whitmore, I would strongly advise against disruptive legal action." There it was again. Not advice. Warning disguised as professionalism. Disruptive to who? I asked quietly. The office air conditioner clicked loudly for a few seconds before Bellamy answered. "Thousands of residents depend on this community structure. Property values, local employment, tourism revenue. There are larger economic realities involved here." Translation. Too many powerful people were making money from Whitmore land. I left the records office with a knot tightening in my chest harder than before. Outside the courthouse, the Texas heat hit like an oven blast, carrying the smell of asphalt and exhaust fumes from Main Street traffic. Across the street, I noticed something that made my stomach drop further. Vanessa Holloway standing beside a black luxury SUV, talking casually with Richard Bellamy through the passenger window. Bellamy saw me immediately and looked away. Vanessa did not. She smiled. Slow, calm, confident. Then she waved at me like we were neighbors at a barbecue. That moment told me everything I needed to know about how deep this situation really went. By the time I reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the western ridge, turning Whitmore Lake orange beneath the subdivision lights. I stood on the old fishing dock listening to cicadas scream through the trees, while expensive music echoed faintly from another wedding reception down the shoreline. Laughter drifted across the water from people celebrating inside a luxury venue built entirely on borrowed ground. My grandfather used to fish from that dock every evening during summer. Said sunsets looked cleaner over open water. I remember sitting beside him once after a thunderstorm rolled through when I was maybe 12 years old. He pointed toward the southern valley where developers were beginning early construction and said something I never forgot. "Most people think ownership means possession," he told me quietly. "But real ownership means patience. Land outlives arrogance every single time." Standing there in the humid dark with subdivision lights reflecting across Whitmore Lake, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Because this was not going to be solved with one conversation or one lawyer meeting anymore. The county was involved. The zoning office was involved. And judging by Vanessa Holloway's confidence, people much higher up already expected me to lose. 3 nights before the lease expiration, I found the hidden clause completely by accident. The storm rolled in just after midnight, rattling the cabin windows hard enough to wake me from the couch where I had fallen asleep, surrounded by property maps and legal folders. Thunder rolled across the valley while rain hammered the tin roof overhead with that deep hollow sound only old ranch houses make. The power flickered twice before stabilizing again. I sat up slowly, neck stiff, boots still on, the smell of stale coffee and wet dust hanging heavy in the air. Papers covered every inch of my grandfather's kitchen table by then. Lease records, easement maps, tax filings, vendor permits. The whole place looked less like a home and more like a war room built out of county paperwork. I rubbed my eyes and reached for another binder near the edge of the table when something slipped loose from inside the back cover and hit the floor. A folded yellow document, smaller than the others, oil stains along the edges. The paper itself felt brittle in my hands like it had not been touched in decades. At the top, typed in faded black letters, were the words Supplemental Commercial Ground Use Addendum. I remember the exact sound the rain made against the windows while I unfolded those pages. Slow, heavy, steady, the kind of storm that makes the whole world feel isolated. Halfway down the second page, I found the paragraph that changed everything. In the event of commercial operation expansion beyond originally disclosed agricultural residential intent, leaseholder agrees that landowner reserves the right to reassess market rate commercial land value upon lease expiration or undisclosed revenue escalation. I read it 3 times because my brain genuinely refused to process what I was seeing. Then I kept reading. Additional clauses followed. Event venue operations. Utility corridor reassessment. Revenue-triggered land valuation adjustments. Every sentence tightened the knot in my chest a little harder. My grandfather did not just lease ranch land to developers. He built safeguards into the contract specifically for future commercial abuse. And according to those documents, Willow Creek Estates had violated nearly every single one. The rain outside intensified while I spread the pages across the kitchen table beneath the overhead light. My pulse was moving faster now. The subdivision was not protected by stability laws anymore. Stability only applied if they honored the original lease conditions. But somewhere over the decades, Willow Creek Estates evolved from a residential neighborhood into a profit-generating commercial enterprise sitting on Whitmore land without updated disclosure agreements. Wedding venues, festivals, vendor contracts, paid parking, outdoor entertainment licensing. Every dollar they made outside basic residential use potentially triggered reassessment rights under the original lease terms. I stood there in silence listening to thunder shake the valley while one terrifying realization settled into place. Vanessa Holloway already knew this. She had to. Nobody acts that confident around expiring land agreements unless they are hiding something bigger. Around 3 in the morning, I drove out toward the ridge overlooking the subdivision. Rain still fell lightly, mist drifting across the valley while subdivision lights glowed through the darkness below like some expensive artificial city dropped into cattle country. From up there, I could see the entire layout clearly for the first time in years. The clubhouse, the event lawn, the lakeside wedding deck, vendor tents folded near the market square, all of it sitting squarely inside Whitmore boundaries. My truck engine idled softly while windshield wipers scraped rhythmically across the glass. Then another detail hit me. Utilities. Every modern development depends on utility access. Water lines, power corridors, drainage easements. I grabbed the survey maps from the passenger seat and started checking routes under the dim cab light. 10 minutes later, my stomach dropped completely. The primary utility corridor feeding nearly the entire southern subdivision crossed directly through retained Whitmore easement zones. My grandfather never transferred ownership. He only permitted access under lease conditions. Conditions expiring in less than 72 hours. The cold realization settled over me slowly while rain tapped against the hood of the truck. This was never just about land rent. Whitmore Valley controlled the infrastructure underneath Willow Creek Estates too. I barely slept after that. By sunrise, I was back inside the cabin scanning every page into digital files while fresh coffee burned bitter in the pot beside me. Outside, fog drifted low across the lake while sprinklers clicked awake inside the subdivision below. Normal suburban morning sounds carried faintly through humid Texas air. Garbage trucks, car doors slamming, lawn crews starting equipment. None of those people had any idea their entire community existed on legal quicksand. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered anyway. Mr. Whitmore, a calm male voice said. This is Douglas Mercer from Holloway Development Legal Services. We would like to discuss a possible extension arrangement regarding the Whitmore lease structure. There it was. Not confusion. Not denial. Extension arrangement. They knew exactly what was happening now. I looked out the kitchen window toward the valley while the smell of fresh rain drifted through the screen door. Funny timing, I said quietly, considering nobody seemed interested in discussing lease terms last week. Silence hung on the line for a second before Mercer answered carefully. We believe cooperation benefits everyone involved. Cooperation. Another polished word covering panic underneath. I told him I would consider a meeting and hung up before he could say more. Then I sat there staring at my grandfather's old maps spread across the table while sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds outside. Every violation notice, every threat, every security patrol, every smug conversation with Vanessa suddenly looked different now. They were never trying to enforce HOA standards. They were buying time. And for the first time since returning to Texas, I realized something that made the entire valley feel very quiet all at once. The people running Willow Creek Estates were not confident anymore. They were scared. Once I realized they were scared, everything inside Willow Creek Estates started looking different. Fear leaves fingerprints if you know where to look. The next morning, 2 separate landscaping crews showed up near the lake before sunrise, replacing old HOA signs with brand new polished ones that suddenly included phrases like Community Stewardship Partnership instead of private property. Somebody was already trying to soften the language before legal paperwork started flying. I watched from the ridge above the valley with binoculars resting on the hood of my truck, while humid morning air carried the smell of wet grass and diesel exhaust uphill. Workers moved fast. Too fast. Like they were following emergency instructions. Around 8 o'clock, a black luxury SUV rolled into the subdivision and parked beside the clubhouse. Vanessa stepped out wearing another perfectly pressed outfit, but this time her movements looked sharper, less relaxed. She spoke rapidly into her phone while pointing toward the lakefront event lawn. A few minutes later, 3 men in button-down shirts arrived carrying folders and laptops into the clubhouse conference room. Lawyers, accountants, maybe both. The valley below suddenly felt less like a neighborhood and more like a corporation scrambling before an audit. I drove into town right after that and met with the only person I trusted to give me a straight answer. Martha Reed, 70 years old, land attorney, ranch family, smoked cigarettes like it was still 1985 and knew more about Texas property law than half the county combined. Her office sat above an old insurance building downtown that smelled like paper, dust, and stale air conditioning. Ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, while courthouse records overflowed from steel filing cabinets along every wall. Martha read through the supplemental lease addendum without speaking for nearly 20 minutes. The only sound in the room was the scratch of her reading glasses against paper and traffic humming outside Main Street. Finally, she leaned back slowly and lit another cigarette near the open window. Your grandfather was smarter than everybody in this county, she muttered. And apparently meaner too. I asked her how bad the situation really was for the HOA. Martha laughed once without humor. Son, if these people operated undisclosed commercial businesses on lease-restricted land for decades without renegotiation, they are standing on a financial landmine. She tapped ash into a coffee mug and pointed at the contract. This clause gives reassessment rights based on current commercial land valuation, not 1974 valuation. Current. My pulse slowed immediately because I already knew what that meant. Whitmore Valley was no longer rural grazing land. The subdivision turned it into premium commercial lakefront property. Martha kept reading quietly before shaking her head again. Wedding venue operations alone could justify massive retroactive exposure. Retroactive exposure. Those words stayed with me all afternoon. By the time I left her office, the Texas heat outside felt suffocating. Asphalt shimmered under sunlight, while courthouse flags snapped sharply in dry wind. I sat inside my truck for a minute staring at the subdivision visible in the distance beyond downtown rooftops. Somewhere over there, Vanessa Holloway was still pretending this situation could be controlled. What she did not realize yet was that I had stopped thinking like a ranch owner days ago. I was thinking like an infrastructure negotiator now. And infrastructure negotiations are never emotional. They are mathematical. I spent the next 2 days quietly preparing. No more arguing with HOA notices. No more reacting emotionally. I hired a forensic accountant from Houston named Daniel Pierce, who specialized in commercial land disputes. Thin guy, navy suit despite the heat. Spoke in calm numbers that sounded more dangerous the longer you listened. We met at the cabin kitchen surrounded by decades of Whitmore paperwork, while cicadas screamed outside loud enough to shake the window screens. Daniel reviewed online vendor contracts, event schedules, tax filings, and permit records for nearly 6 straight hours. By sunset, he looked genuinely stunned. "Caleb," he said carefully, "they are not operating like an HOA anymore. This is essentially an entertainment and hospitality business wrapped inside a residential structure." He started listing revenue streams one after another while scribbling calculations across legal pads. Wedding packages, seasonal festivals, vendor leasing, community event sponsorships, recreational memberships, dock rentals, parking revenue, advertising, agreements. My grandfather's old cabin suddenly felt very quiet while those numbers piled higher and higher. Daniel finally set his pen down and looked directly at me. "If reassessment rights trigger under this clause," he said slowly, "their current land usage valuation could increase several 100% overnight." Several 100%. I thought about Vanessa standing beside the lake talking down to me like I was some lost ranch hand too dumb to understand modern development. Meanwhile, her entire financial empire sat on a lease violation ticking toward expiration by the hour. That evening, I drove through Willow Creek Estates again just before sunset. Residents jogged along the walking paths carrying iced coffees while kids rode bicycles near decorative fountains. Somebody grilled burgers near the community pavilion. Music drifted softly across the lake from outdoor patio speakers. On the surface, everything looked perfect, peaceful, wealthy, stable. But now I could see the cracks underneath. Security guards whispering near the clubhouse entrance. Maintenance workers replacing signage. County vehicles parked behind the administration building after hours. The whole place had the nervous energy of people trying to fix a leak before anyone notices the basement flooding. Then I saw something that confirmed everything. A temporary sign outside the clubhouse announced an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for the following night. Residents only. Financial planning discussion. Vanessa Holloway moved fast. I will give her that. But emergency meetings do not happen inside calm organizations. They happen when panic starts spreading through people who thought they controlled the future. I parked near the old lakeside dock after dark and stepped out into humid air thick with the smell of algae and cedar trees. Subdivision lights reflected across Whitmore Lake while frogs croaked softly near the shoreline. Somewhere inside the clubhouse, I could see silhouettes moving rapidly behind conference room windows. Lawyers probably. Accountants too. Maybe county officials. But standing there beside my grandfather's water under that heavy Texas night sky, I realized something important for the first time since this whole mess started. They were no longer deciding whether to fight me. They were trying to calculate how much losing would cost. The lease expired at midnight on a Thursday, and Willow Creek Estates woke up Friday morning to the financial equivalent of an earthquake. I was already awake before sunrise, sitting on the cabin porch with black coffee in my hands while heavy fog drifted low across Whitmore Lake. The air smelled like wet cedar and rain-soaked dirt after another humid Texas night. Somewhere down in the subdivision, automatic sprinklers clicked across perfectly manicured lawns like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. At exactly 12:01 that morning, Martha Reed filed the reassessment notices with the county clerk, while Daniel Pierce electronically delivered certified financial demand letters to the HOA board, Holloway Development Holdings, and every registered commercial vendor operating inside Willow Creek Estates. I watched the valley slowly brighten under gray morning clouds while my phone vibrated nonstop beside me on the porch table. Emails, missed calls, voicemails stacking one after another from numbers I did not recognize. Lawyers mostly. By 6:30 in the morning, 3 black SUVs had already arrived outside the clubhouse. Through binoculars, I could see people rushing between vehicles carrying folders and laptops, while security guards tried redirecting confused residents away from the administration office. The panic had started early. Daniel called first. His voice sounded calmer than usual, which somehow made the situation feel even bigger. The Reserve Bank flagged the reassessment exposure immediately, he said. They froze discretionary operating transfers, pending legal review. I stared across the lake while steam rose from my coffee cup in the cool morning air. How bad? I asked quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly. Based on current commercial valuation and disclosed revenue streams, the revised land usage assessment increased approximately 512%. 512%. I remember hearing birds chirping softly in the cedar trees around the cabin while those numbers settled into my head. Every wedding contract, every vendor permit, every community event, every dock membership and parking fee now sat under commercial land reassessment rates tied directly to Whitmore ownership rights. My grandfather built a legal trap nearly 50 years earlier, then waited long enough for arrogance to walk straight into it. By 8 o'clock, residents started gathering outside the clubhouse parking lot in clusters. I drove into the subdivision slowly just after sunrise and immediately felt the difference in the atmosphere. No more relaxed morning joggers. No golf carts cruising peacefully through the neighborhood. People stood in driveways holding printed emails and talking in tense voices while county vehicles lined the curb outside the administration building. The smell of fresh coffee and hot asphalt filled the humid air as delivery trucks struggled to turn around near blocked parking areas. Then I saw the notices. Large white papers taped across multiple clubhouse entrances. Temporary suspension of event operations pending land use review. The wedding scheduled for that afternoon had apparently been canceled. Florists loaded arrangements back into vans while angry couples argued near the front steps. One caterer actually threw his clipboard onto the pavement hard enough for papers to scatter across the parking lot. The entire polished image of Willow Creek Estates was cracking in real time. I parked near the lake and stepped out slowly while residents stared openly now. Some looked confused, some furious. Others honestly looked scared. Most had probably lived there for years without ever hearing the words ground lease before that morning. Then the clubhouse doors slammed open and Vanessa Holloway stormed outside, surrounded by attorneys carrying folders. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the difference in her posture immediately. The perfect control was gone. Her blonde hair looked rushed for the first time since I met her. Her expression sharp, tight, tired. She spotted me near the parking lot and started walking fast in my direction across the pavement. What exactly do you think you were doing? She demanded before even reaching me. No smile this time. No polished suburban charm. Just raw anger barely contained beneath professionalism. The smell of expensive perfume mixed awkwardly with sweat and heat radiating off the pavement. I stayed calm. Exercising contractual reassessment rights tied to expired commercial lease conditions. One of her attorneys immediately stepped forward trying to interrupt, but Vanessa raised her hand sharply without taking her eyes off me. You cannot destabilize an entire residential community over technical interpretations, she snapped. Technical interpretations. That almost made me laugh considering she spent years weaponizing technical HOA violations against everyone else. Your organization generated millions in undisclosed commercial revenue on Whitmore land. I replied evenly. The contract specifically addresses commercial reassessment exposure. Residents nearby started listening openly now. I watched the realization spread slowly across faces standing around the parking lot. They did not know. Vanessa had never told them the subdivision sat on leased ground. She never disclosed the commercial clauses. One older man holding a printed reassessment notice looked directly at her and asked the question out loud. Wait, we do not actually own this land. Silence hit the parking lot hard enough to feel physical. Somewhere nearby, a maintenance cart beeped in reverse, while workers quietly removed event signs from the lawn near the lake. Vanessa looked around at the gathering crowd and finally understood something she could not control anymore. The secrecy was gone. A woman near the entrance started reading portions of the reassessment letter out loud. Another resident shouted about emergency dues increases already rumored inside the HOA board meeting. Somebody else demanded to know why wedding businesses were operating under residential agreements. The crowd turned restless fast. Not violent, just betrayed. Years of HOA authority suddenly looked very fragile under daylight and legal paperwork. Vanessa stepped closer toward me, lowering her voice sharply. You are destroying this community. I looked past her toward Whitmore Lake, where workers were already dismantling decorative wedding arches beside my grandfather's dock. The smell of cut flowers drifted through humid morning air while residents argued across the parking lot behind us. No, I said quietly. Your greed did that all by itself. The collapse happened slowly for about 48 hours, then all at once. By Monday morning, Willow Creek Estates looked nothing like the polished suburban kingdom Vanessa Holloway spent years building. County audit vehicles lined the entrance road beside news vans and contractor trucks waiting for payment approvals that were no longer coming. The decorative fountain near the clubhouse had been shut off to reduce operating expenses, leaving behind the sour smell of standing water and algae baking under brutal Texas heat. Half the landscaping crews were gone already. Perfect hedges started browning at the edges without constant maintenance. It amazed me how quickly expensive places begin looking fragile once money stops flowing through them. I stood beside the old Whitmore fence line, watching movers haul event furniture out of the lakeside venue, while cicadas screamed from cedar trees overhead. The entire valley sounded different now. Less artificial. Fewer golf carts. Fewer outdoor speakers playing fake resort music across the water. Just wind, insects, and the occasional sound of angry voices echoing from emergency HOA meetings happening nearly every night inside the clubhouse. Residents had finally learned the truth. Not rumors. Not technicalities. Truth. They discovered the subdivision sat entirely on leased Whitmore ground. They discovered the commercial businesses hidden inside the HOA structure generated millions in undisclosed revenue. And most importantly, they discovered Vanessa Holloway knew all of it for years. The outrage spread fast after that. Homeowners started demanding financial records. Vendors filed breach of contract complaints over canceled weddings and suspended events. One landscaping company parked equipment directly outside the administration office until unpaid invoices were addressed. The whole polished illusion cracked apart under basic sunlight and accounting. Daniel Pierce called me Tuesday afternoon while I repaired fence posts near the northern pasture. Sweat burned my eyes under the Texas heat, while the smell of fresh-cut cedar drifted through the air from a fallen branch nearby. You might want to sit down for this, he said calmly. I leaned against the fence anyway. The county initiated a formal financial misconduct review this morning. Apparently, several reserve accounts were commingled with event revenue streams. Commingled. Another careful legal word hiding a disaster underneath. How bad? I asked. Daniel paused for a second. Bad enough that multiple board members are already contacting independent counsel. I looked down toward the subdivision spread across Whitmore Valley below the ridge. Even from that distance, I could see activity swarming around the clubhouse parking lot like disturbed ants. Lawyers, accountants, residents demanding answers. The machine was eating itself now. Later that evening, I drove into town for diesel fuel and stopped at Mason Feed and Hardware again. The second I walked inside, the conversation shifted. Not silent exactly, just heavier. People looked at me differently now. Curtis Nolan sat at the same counter stool drinking black coffee, while local news played quietly above the register. The television showed aerial footage of Willow Creek Estates while reporters discussed county investigations into undisclosed commercial land agreements. Curtis shook his head slowly as I walked over. Walter would have enjoyed every second of this, he muttered. I laughed despite myself. He probably expected it. Curtis pointed his coffee cup toward the television. Most folks around here knew Vanessa was squeezing people for years. Nobody realized how deep it went. That seemed to be the part hitting residents hardest. The deception. Most homeowners were not villains. They bought houses believing they lived in a normal suburban development. Instead, they unknowingly became part of a private commercial operation controlled by people treating Whitmore Valley like a personal revenue stream. On Thursday afternoon, Vanessa finally showed up at the ranch alone. No attorneys. No security. No golf cart parade. Just a black SUV crawling slowly up the gravel road toward the cabin while dry wind pushed dust across the pasture. I was sitting on the porch repairing one of my grandfather's old tackle boxes when she stepped out wearing jeans and sunglasses instead of polished country club outfits. For the first time since meeting her, she looked tired. truly tired. The valley behind her shimmered under late afternoon heat, while grasshoppers buzzed through the weeds around the porch steps. She stood there silently for a moment before speaking. "You could have negotiated privately," she said quietly. I set the tackle box down and looked at her carefully. "I tried discussing ownership weeks ago. You sent violation notices instead." The wind rattled the porch screen softly while she stared out toward Whitmore Lake in the distance. "Do you have any idea how many families are terrified right now?" she asked. That question irritated me immediately because it revealed the one thing Vanessa still did not understand even after all this. She still viewed herself as the victim of consequences she personally created. "You built commercial businesses on leased land without disclosure," I said evenly. "You threatened people with fines while hiding the truth from them. That fear belongs to you." She looked away after that. No comeback. No polished smile. Just silence hanging between us while evening light settled over the ranch. Finally, she nodded once and walked back toward the SUV. Halfway there, she stopped without turning around. "Walter always hated me," she said softly. I looked out across the valley where subdivision lights were beginning to flicker on beneath gathering dusk. "No," I answered quietly. "He just understood you." Vanessa left without another word. 2 weeks later, the county removed her from the Zoning Advisory Board investigation entirely. Several HOA board members resigned. Commercial operations inside Willow Creek Estates were dissolved and restructured under transparent land agreements tied directly to Whitmore ownership oversight. I lowered residential lease costs for homeowners willing to transition into the new agricultural district structure because, unlike Vanessa, I never wanted to punish families for someone else's greed. The wedding venue closed permanently, though. So did the fake luxury branding. Funny thing is, Whitmore Valley actually looked better afterward. Cleaner somehow. Real again. Some evenings now I still sit on the old fishing dock beside the lake listening to frogs croak through the reeds while warm Texas wind moves across the water. No loud event music. No forced perfection. Just the smell of cedar, lake water, and summer grass the way my grandfather remembered it. He used to tell me land remembers exactly how people treat it. Standing there beneath quiet stars reflected across Whitmore Lake, I finally realized he was right.